So welcome everyone to the Peoria Riverfront Museum's Art Club. Thank you for joining. I'm Heather Placco, the program manager, and I'm excited to be hosting artist Mark Holmes today from Galesburg for today's Art Club presentation. Throughout, Mark welcomes questions and comments. Feel free to unmute yourself and ask questions, or alternatively, if you don't wish to talk, you may type questions in the comment section and I'm happy to ask those for you. So without further ado, a big welcome to Mark.
Well, hello, everybody. Glad you can join me. Glad I can join you. Thank you for this opportunity. I will, I think, begin by just sharing my screen here with you, my slide presentation. Yeah, so every time I do one of these, which is, I don't know, 4 or 5 times a year generally, they're a little bit different than the last. And that's a nice thing. It gives me, each one is an opportunity to sort of look at my work in a new way. There's always some minor revelation, some connection I make, something I see that I hadn't seen before. And that's often because of questions that people ask. So yeah, let me just emphasize that I'm really happy to entertain your questions as they arise, rather than waiting to the end. It gives me some idea of who I'm talking to, and it may let us go in directions that are of particular interest to you. When often I do these presentations for groups of students, college students and such, and so I always include some of my work as a student. And I'm going to do that today, but we're also we'll be spending more time with things I've done more recently over the last 10 years or so. And along the way, I hope to be able to highlight some points, some things that are particularly important to me, or that recur throughout my work, themes and ideas that become of particular importance. So I first started getting involved in sculpture as a student in the mid-1970s. I was in Minnesota, as perhaps you could see, at a college there. I came to college with a lot of experience making things. I loved to make things of all sorts. I had built buildings and made model airplanes and built a darkroom for myself. And I was just very, very motivated to make stuff. At the same time, I kind of grew up in a world of abstractions, one could say. My father was a philosophy professor, and our dinner table conversations were often quite abstract, dealing with, you know, my assigned reading for the week, whether it was Kant or Aristotle. And my father would grill us about these ideas. And so sculpture to me, I think, when I sort of first discovered it, was a place where I could bring together these two worlds, a world of ideas and abstractions, along with a world of material and making and solving material problems with my hands. I had also been very involved in photography in high school. I had a couple jobs as a photographer, and I think that sort of sensitized me to things visual, to sort of approach the world with a lot of visual interest and take delight in things that I found there. So these are, what I've shown you here is a group of steel sculptures from the first year or two that I was studying sculpture. I was at the time looking at the work of some American sculptors, but in particular, the British sculptor Anthony Caro. If anybody is familiar with Caro, Sir Anthony Caro now. But one thing that looking at these now, I realize it's it's quite interesting to me that each of these are really about shaping space, about using a linear structure to define a space, and to really think about the relationship between form and space. I don't know exactly where I would have gotten that idea, but it seems clear now that that was an interest, and that actually continues to be something that runs through my work, as you'll see, 40 years or so later, 35 years later. Yeah, coming up on 40. Um, but I did a lot of work with steel, and steel at the time, especially, and really throughout the middle of the 20th century, steel had become one of the kind of default modes, materials of modern sculpture ever since it was first explored by Picasso and Julio Gonzalez at the beginning of the century. And then by the time those ideas reached America in the 1940s and 50s, and the American sculptor David Smith, so steel lent itself to really thinking about sculpture in spatial terms, because you could do things with it that no other medium would allow. You can suspend itself in space in kind of miraculous ways, in a way that stone or, something carved perhaps couldn't. It was also the material that became, of course, sort of iconic of the industrial era, particularly of the mid 20th century. It was the stuff the world was built out of, skyscrapers and bridges and things. Anyway, so I was quite interested in steel for about the first 5 years or so of my work. Later, I took a break as an undergraduate and came back and started working with wood. This is at a college in Michigan. I was looking at the work at the time of Martin Puryear, who is a well-known American sculptor who does remarkable things with wood, who sort of has almost single-handedly rejuvenated the whole notion of craft within sculpture. This is a piece which is made out of thin strips of redwood and spruce bent over a steam bent frame of ash. It's about 13 feet tall. And if I had a slide, I could show you, as you walk around it, it opens up and you can see the structure, much like the inside of a wooden boat, for instance. I had a friend in Michigan who was making wooden boats, and I think that had some effect on me, obviously.
Mark,
Yeah,
we have a question about
great,
your
great.
steel. Were your steel works welded?
Yes, yeah. I had actually learned to weld, I don't know, sometime before I started college, when I was about 17, working for a summer camp. And so having that skill was great. And at the time also, steel was plentiful and cheap from scrap yards. So students could really work with it. These days it's much harder, because for a whole lot of reasons. But mostly because insurance companies no longer allow students to browse through scrap yards, and it's had a huge effect on sculpture. But yes, they were all welded with some bolted elements. But I very much liked the process of welding and of grinding and welding to get a joint to be just so. Um, I, I, in graduate school, I sort of played with or engaged with ideas that were current at the time in the early and mid 1980s. This is a group of pieces that it sort of raises another theme in my work, which has to do with the kind of logic or the vernaculars of construction. To think of constructing, of how things are made, as a kind of language that has within it certain rules and syntax. And my work was interested in sort of exploring some of these conventions of making and the syntax. So the way walls are constructed and foundations, and sort of playing with some of those ideas, or even ironically turning them inside out and things. But throughout another one of the big influences on my work and the work of almost every sculptor and many artists, period, of my age, was that when I first became involved in the art world, it was during a period when a movement, minimalism, for those of you who may be familiar with minimalism and the ideas of minimalism from the 1960s and early 1970s. But minimalism asked these rather challenging, somewhat philosophical questions about what art could be. And as somebody who had studied philosophy and was really interested in philosophy, it really interested me a lot. And so a lot of my work became very reduced using some of the ideas of minimalism. And when in graduate school at Yale in the 1980s, many of those artists were around, either teaching full-time or available to us, and it had quite an influence on me. So this is a series, and this is about after graduate school in about 1984. I was teaching in Virginia at the time, or 85. And they are a series of really freestanding paintings, much like hollow slab doors. They're very lightweight wooden structures made out of 1/8-inch thick birch plywood, hollow in the middle, and fastened to the floor in such a way that they could stand on their own. And they had these areas of color that sort of wrap around edges or around from one side to another. And this is something else that you'll see in the work I'm doing now and more recently, is looking at the relationship between the way color and it can become almost like a separable object from the thing that it's on, as if these colors could be peeled off, that they have a kind of strong optical presence, which is distinct from the wood. Sometimes they seem to sort of move to project themselves out in space off the surface of the wood. There's a certain kind of an illusion that they create. I'm not seeing text, by the way, or any chat messages, because I have my screen expanded. So do feel free to speak up with any questions, but I'm going to move kind of quickly through some things. On the left is a large installation work, or a site-specific work, a piece that I designed specifically for a space in the Chrysler Museum in Norfolk, Virginia. There are these large, it's all based on an 8-foot module. So these sort of steel platform-like things you see are 8 feet, and each of these hollow plywood objects are 8 feet. They are, again, made out of a lightweight plywood, and the joints are covered and sanded using joint compound or spackling. So they have a slightly ghosty sort of presence, this whiteness that which is partly just a residue of the sanding, or the feeling of a not yet completed thing, something that is still in process, much like a drawing, a little bit, the way a drawing can suggest something that's still in process, something provisional, an idea coming into being. But they related more specifically to the architecture of the room, these neoclassical vaultings and arches in the room. And it was something that viewers were sort of forced to move around by literally having to sort of bend their body around this thing to understand it fully. This on the right, and this is kind of a pivotal moment for me, um, is the same material. It is these objects from the work on the left. About a month after the show closed, and I thought, well, I put all the time into making these things. Let's see what else I can do with them. So I started cutting them up and working with them in other ways. And this um, this idea of making things, not knowing what they might become, but to make a thing in order perhaps to edit it, cut it up, explore it in new ways, rather than simply conceiving of something and executing it to completion. The idea would be to make something and then treat it like a found object, like, oh, I found this thing. Let's see what I can do with it. And this is another example of this. So this is a piece that that relates to an interest I had at the time in Italian futurism. It's called Baccioni's bicycle, but this was a plywood bicycle, again made out of thin bent plywood, which had been laminated with canvas. And the bicycle, when it was totally together, was like a real bicycle, but about 12 feet long and 6 feet high. So it was a big, sort of comically overblown bicycle. And then I started cutting it up and exploring the relationship between these parts and what else could become of it. And so what this really becomes is me um, moving away from the kind of rigorous way of thinking, or the rigid way of thinking about form that minimalism had sort of required of me, and to move things in a more kind of gestural, freer way. Things that tumble through space and don't necessarily meet don't necessarily come together in a rational sort of formation. This one was based on a tuba. It was a big tuba shape.
Mark, I have a question for
Yeah.
you. So your pieces here, you have a lot of thoughts and concepts behind them. I wondered, how much do you give the viewer, the person viewing your art? Do you give them all this context in the label, or do you let them interpret for themselves?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I I usually, well, with some work I don't title it. Or will call it untitled, and then I have my own sort of system of notation to keep track of it. With other work, I do title it, and I try to title in a way that sort of suggests or leads people down any number of paths without requiring them to think of it in one way. You know, the work, I think every artist has to recognize that their work is open to interpretation, that people will do with, will go where they may with it ultimately. I At the same time, I like to think that some interpretations are, you know, make more sense than others. Not every interpretation is equally valid in my view. But I can't remember. It really depends on the work a lot.
Thank you. And I have another question, if you don't
Good,
mind.
good. No.
Last week, our art, or not last week, sorry, last month, our artist Jessica Bingham, one of
Yeah.
the curators at
No,
ISU,
yeah.
she was presenting, and she talked a lot about reuse of her work too, and reutilizing it in future works. Do you
Uh-huh.
feel like that's for you, that's from an environmental pull, or just from a wanting to reform and rework your own ideas again in new
That's great.
ways?
No, that's a good question. Thank you. Yeah, it's not really. I mean, I'd like to be able to claim that that came out of some kind of environmental conscience I have, but not really. It also has to do with the realities of that if you make big sculptures, you end up with a whole pile of stuff laying around,
Sure.
and sometimes it's like, well, I could throw this out, or I can make something else out of it. So it's really just trying to get, retreads, as it were. But also, increasingly, it became really a very intentional way of working. with this next group of pieces, for instance, were similar to the bicycle. They're much smaller pieces that sit on these kind of plywood pedestals, but they all involved making something, rather some kind of sort of eccentric object using a variety of materials. This started off as a kind of wall, looking like about a 3-foot large old-fashioned wall-mounted telephone, and made out of plaster and very thin plywood, and sort of very directly, even kind of crudely put together. And then I started cutting it up, and it became more of almost a figurative work, like a figure bending towards almost. Um, I began to think of it as a kind of Madonna figure, even. But each of these works are diptychs. That is, they are things that they are works in two pieces. So it is this object, which again can be made out of any. These are some of the first works I ever made that really involved a lot of different materials. So scraps of aluminum, rubber. This is sort of a thick rubber banding along the. Sorry, I'm pointing with my fingers as if you can all see me. Um, that's wound around the top. They're very kind of light. They include a lot of space. They feel as if they're very provisionally made, as if they are just sort of barely have come together. Again, a little like a drawing. They have some of this, the feeling of something as being sketched out. In a, like I'm thinking about this object, but I haven't quite, I haven't turned it into a permanent reality yet. So anyway, there's these objects, and then they are stationed on these pedestals in front of these panels, which are cast plaster panels about 2 inches thick, heavy. They're solid plaster panels about 2 inches thick, and the color on them is hot wax, is encaustic. So oil paint and beeswax and some paraffin that's been melted and then painted and troweled across the panels. In part of what interested me about this is of course just the visual relationship between these objects and the paintings. I had seen a show sometime before this of Brancusi sculptures paired with Mondrian paintings. And it impressed me to understand the relationship between these things. But they also, they express sort of two different dimensions of my work. I have always been drawn to kind of pure abstraction, traditions of reductive abstraction, particularly those that arise in the mid-20th century with painters like Mondrian. But I was also always drawn to the kind of thick and messy making of making something without really knowing what it's going to become, and opening myself to letting materials determine a form, for instance. And so the kind of dialogue, the conversation between these objects and the paintings are also kind of a conversation between me and myself, between my two different artistic identities, I think, looking at it now. I don't know if I could have articulated that at the time. These are about 25 years old, but there was a whole series of, everything I'm showing you represents some larger group of works generally. I'm sure you get the idea already that and this has been true throughout my work. I've never been able to really stick with one thing for more than about a year. My work is episodic. I get really involved in something. I try to kind of define a question, something that interests me, or at least a kind of direction for exploration. And I pursue that until either I become bored or consumed in self-doubt, or I just feel that it's exhausted. And then I move on to the next thing. And so many of these things I'm showing you, happen back to back. These are from a group of objects I made. They're wall hanging, sort of two-part. I think of them very much like altarpieces, sort of early Renaissance and medieval altarpieces. They relate to some of my own religious upbringing and my religious convictions, but they are hollow, made out of veneer, maple objects that have this hinge. So it's two halves, each of which is a reflection of the other. So it's symmetrical, but not symmetrical. And then I had friends who were academically trained painters actually paint these areas, which are quotes from important art historical painting. This one is quoted, is a sky from a Van Rysdale painting, 17th century Dutch landscape artist. And this, of course, a deposition from the cross. But I made these, I stuck with these for about a year. I'm going to move a little faster now and skip over some things as I go. I had since leaving graduate school, a couple of things were happening to my work. One of which is that I was making more and more kind of contained portable objects, because at the time we were having children, and I was thinking about how I could make my work in smaller chunks of time. During this period, I owned a furniture design firm and furniture making firm in Chicago, and I had employees, and I had to squeeze out an hour a day in the studio very often. And I was picking up scraps off the floor of my shop, and going at lunch into my little studio at the shop and making sculpture. I was also getting more and more interested in color, and really thinking of color perhaps more in terms of the relationship between what a painting could be and a sculpture could be. So making sculptures that had a sort of a stronger optical or presence, or to think of paintings primarily as objects rather than simply an image. And so I was becoming just really interested in this idea of kind of the in-between space between something which, on the one hand, exerted itself, as an object. It had a particular weight and materiality to it, but also which carried this kind of pronounced, vivid optical experience, even sometimes a little bit slippery or illusionistic, like not being able to quite pin down where things are in space. So this is from a group of sculptures made out of, you can see my, the furniture making and woodworking background pops through every once in a while. This is a mahogany grid that I constructed. And the only place you can see that it's actually mahogany here is on this, if you kind of look off to the side behind the piece here. And in other places, I somewhat irreverently, I suppose, paint over the mahogany with latex. Real woodworkers don't paint mahogany with latex, by the way. This is another one of those. And then they have plaster as part of them. Each of these has a section which is actually plaster cast over this grid, this sort of contorted grid. So this is now getting to be about 10 years or so ago. this is a group of, I often, going back to the question about titling, I often titling my pieces as a group. I will title a whole series of pieces. And this is from a group called Reach, R-E-A-C-H. And it's because, of course, the way they kind of reach in space. I think of them very much as sort of sections of torsos and arms, bracketing, trying to grab some space, but also opening them to the space around them. They are things that hang on the wall. They involve color, obviously. These are made with a wooden inner structure that is made out of poplar, but then I laminate over that with, if anybody's familiar with MDF, medium density fiberboard, it looks like cardboard essentially, but it's these very eighth inch thick strip skins. It's really skinned with this material. And I very much wanted the kind of neutrality of that material, of some like a new cardboard box, you know, that pristine neutrality that the material has and the way the color acts on top of that. These become quite sort of subtly illusionistic in terms of, you know, there's actually two different green colors here, but the way the piece sometimes shadows itself, you don't know what if you're seeing the same color in shadow or a different color.
Mark, there was a question about the sizes of these pieces.
Yeah, oh, that's great. Thank you for asking. Yeah, so these are about, literally relate to this idea of reaching. So they are, you know, on this one, for instance, I think from top to bottom, it's about 4 feet. And then they project off the wall anywhere from a foot to 2 feet. I also think of them as a little bit like tumblers or little, you know, athletes kind of tumbling across the wall. Imagine a gymnast doing floor exercises only on the wall. They have a kind of playful relationship to the wall. At almost the same time I was working on those, I was working on a show for a gallery in Chicago. And this is a group of mostly cast plaster pieces that I did for that show. There's a story here that we won't take time to fully tell, but I had 6 months before this show, and it was a show that was important to me. It was kind of a major thing. But 6 months before it, I broke all the bones in my right hand with an accident. And I had no use of my right hand and my right arm. And the question immediately became, do I cancel the show or do I figure out what I can do with my left hand and 1 foot, you know? And so these are all works that were sort of responding to that challenge. They're all about 2 to 3 feet across. They're very, very heavy. They are hollow inside, but each side of them is sort of cast by building a slot between a form, which was really a slot between 2 pieces of wood, and then pouring the plaster in through the edge. And then after I'd make one side, I would sort of, it's almost like a process of inside out making, if you can imagine. I was just interested in the kind of intellectual problem this was, as well as the physical problem. So I would cast one side and then build a form for the next side. And so like a lot of my work, it really becomes about sort of discovering a form through the process of making, rather than inventing something, you know, conceiving of something through drawing or just, you know, having a clear plan and then executing it. That way of making has stopped to hold much interest for me, because I've made so much furniture and buildings and things that are made according to plan, that it's important for me that making, in the case of my sculpture, is itself a kind of process of thinking and discovery. And so these pieces really take that up in a really difficult way. Actually, they are in some ways the most difficult, challenging work I've ever made. I don't know why my slideshow just stopped. Here we go. Um, here's some other examples of them. They have lights in them, or a number of them do. That's what these cords are about. Here you can see over here this dim glow of an orange light just kind of oozing out the end of this one.
Was this the first time, Mark, that you put lights on the inside of your works rather than had lights on the outside?
Yeah, it's not the first time that I had included lights in my work. No, I had done some of that in graduate school, but it's the first time I used it in this way, that it's a kind of very subtle element ultimately in the work. I mean, the chords are more pronounced than the light itself. Like this one, you can barely see. There is a green light. If you just look carefully, you'll see there's a greenness here. And it's a green light that just kind of oozes out through this slot between a piece of aluminum. And this piece is made out of plaster and Kevlar, by the way. But you know, or this one, there's just this little half-inch hole in the end of this kind of pyramid-like shape. And it focuses a light that then can be seen on the wall. So it's a kind of a projector. Here's another one that's a hanging model. They involve plaster and wood and aluminum and half-inch plexiglass. You know, and actually included in that same show were a number of these pieces. These are going back to this continuing interest I have in the wall. One of the artists who has had a big effect on me over the years was Ellsworth Kelly. And these are, I think, they owe quite a lot to Kelly. They are made out of layers and layers of plywood. So actually 4 or 5 layers of 3/4 inch plywood. So they're, you know, 3.5 or 4 1/4 inches thick. And you really feel their weight on the wall. You can sense exactly how heavy they are. But then the surface, you know, is meticulously sanded and painted in a very matte, flat way. So you kind of the surface is simply the kind of the presence of the color without any sort of material interruption to it, you know. So it's this, again, it's this sort of strong sensation of color in optical experience, which is related but still feels detachable to the material reality of the object. One of the reasons I became so interested in color is that color I began to see as sort of this, you know, perhaps the slipperiest of our perceptual abilities, of our senses, is our sense of color. Color changes constantly, depending on the light in the room, depending on the time of day, depending on the associations each of us might have with that color, depending on, well, you know, any number of things. This is a group of triptych. This is a group of 3. This is the closest I've ever come to actually making a painting, by the way. But this is a group of 3 objects that actually are shown together. And I made these in memoriam of my father when he died. But they're thick. They're essentially plywood boxes laminated with canvas. They're about, each one is about 18 inches across. And sorry, but there's these 3 of them. And they led me into this group of work from about 5 or 6 years ago. And I collectively titled these The Color Guard. These are each about between 72 and 76 or 77 inches tall. So human height or just a little bit taller. And each of them is a, box-like structure, but they are laminated with layers of canvas, the same canvas that painters paint on. And the seams between uh, where they're laminated, sometimes you see. So there is this sort of subtle suggestion of sections or of them coming together in pieces. And then the color is oil paints and wax, very viscous, thick paint, which has been applied a little bit like icing on a birthday cake with a knife. And the surface of each one varies a little bit. The lines through them are not applied on top of the overall color, but that is actually the canvas, which has been stained prior to the the overall color. And so those lines are preserved. In other words, working with a knife, I would come up to the line, but not cover the line. And I did this without first plotting, without drawing lines. So it was just a matter of sort of finding these lines through a kind of hand-eye mind, making decisions while I was working with my hand in my eyes. And there's no going back, once there's no erasing it or getting back. Once those lines were covered, they were gone. And it's very laborious. It's very tedious. It's almost absurd as a way of making something. But this idea of really slowing everything down and making things at that these lines, some of the way the paint is pushed up against these lines has a kind of intensity. There's a certain kind of psychic intensity to that act, to the laboriousness of it, the thickness of it. You can kind of see, I always felt you can actually see me thinking my way through this. But they're always shown in these large groups of 10 or more. Oh, sorry, wrong way again. After that sort of ran its course, and I began, and this really became a pretty radical shift. All of my work up to this point, everything I've shown you, I think, was made through construction of one sort or another, but working with hard materials, taking one thing and joining it to the next. And in that way, when one makes something in that way, it's often the case that a couple of initial decisions, by cutting a big shape out of a piece of wood or by putting two things together, it's often the case that the overall shape of what one is making becomes determined by a couple of important initial decisions. Here, I wanted to work in a way that would avoid that a kind of making without any hierarchy, if you will. And so these are made out of clay, and they're not made out of, for those of you who know a little bit about ceramics and how things can be made with clay, typically something like these may be made with slabs where you roll out like a pie crust, roll out slabs of clay and then construct with them, much like a piece of plywood. But these are actually made one pinch at a time. So I would literally grab a piece of clay in my hands, roll it into something about the size of my thumb, and set it down, and add a next piece to that, and the next piece to that. And so it is the same act, the same gesture, repeated a zillion times until they're done. I would start each one with very little idea of its shape, sometimes a pretty vague sense of where it was going. but I really thought of it as almost a mindless kind of activity. You know, imagine crocheting a huge sweater without paying any attention to its form. Uh, 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 there's a certain level of absurdity involved. The only thing I knew is that I wanted them to get tall because I like the idea of making wet. There's something very interesting to me about the kind of elemental primal nature of clay as a material. You know, when you think of it, the very first acts of human making probably involved clay, reaching down and picking up some mud. And the idea then of raising mud, wet mud, the earth itself, right? Raising it up, um, giving it the kind of presence on the landscape, to give it as a marker of human will. And I was quite drawn uh, for for a lot of reasons to that idea. And I think I made about 15 of these ultimately, which again have been, when they're shown, are shown in groups. I'm I'm something I'm really interested in these is the kind of shapes that occur between them as you walk between them and around them. So this shape, for instance, or this one, right? These intervals or the negative spaces. And so I began to pursue that through these large drawings that are as large as, again, they're about 7 feet tall, which I would sometimes then show alongside the sculptures. I guess I don't have a picture of that. But these are charcoal drawings which are made from those shapes in between. There's so much more to say about those. Okay, I'm going to race through in the last 5 minutes here. And for the since then, I've been working mostly on smaller wall objects, just odd little wall constructions in wood. And I'll just show you some examples of those. Some of them are very, very crisp, quite almost graphic, and others of them are a little bit messier. But they all are things that kind of meet the wall or sit on the wall at these odd angles. They're sort of sliding in and out of the space of the wall. They're a little illusionistic, perhaps, in that way. This one is perhaps a little cruder, more direct than some of the others. But I do think of these as being both paintings and sculptures. And I'm not, although I don't generally talk about them in that way, they're objects that hang on the wall and have color on them. They're very light. This last group of them I call kites because of the way they seem to almost hover, and they're hollow inside. So you can kind of feel the buoyancy of them, that there's air inside them. But they're literally, you know, some of these weigh less than a pound. And these are all, well, this one is about 18 inches top to bottom. Some of them, this one is more like 4 feet top to bottom. Likewise, this one is one of the larger ones, but you could get a sense of how far they come off the wall, perhaps. The way this hangs on the wall, I think this, what you're seeing here, comes off the wall about 18 inches or so.
It's interesting, Mark, your pieces, this series you're showing right now, all of the front facing paint is
Yeah,
very precise and crisp. And then
right.
every once in a while on the inside of one, I'll see a little smudge of paint that looks very
Yeah,
splattery. Is that
yeah.
on purpose?
Oh yeah, yeah. Yeah, there's, you know, well, they just kind of reflect multiple things that I love. You know, on the one hand, I love a painter like, William de Kooning, who makes big movements of paints, in a just big, broad gestural strokes. But I also love, this almost design-like, right, graphic, crisp movement of shapes. But I like the fact that the insides of these things, the backs of them, which are often visible, as you can see here, you get to explore how they are made. There's sort of a whole nother experience back there. And sometimes I would just, try out a color back there. And I like that they are sort of a little bit like going backstage, to say, oh, look, that's how they made Pinocchio's nose wiggle or whatever. But I like that they have those kind of two different things going on. One which is kind of very direct, even crude, and another which is very refined and clean. And then finally, these are things I'm working on now. This is a group, again, of wall-mounted pieces made out of, the wood is a ½ an inch thick, so thicker than wood you typically buy from a lumber, thinner than what you would typically think of as a board coming from the lumberyard. And with these painted areas on it. The color here is actually not so good. This is more like fluorescent orange, actually. But, going back to the first thing I showed you, these are all about shaping space, right? Ultimately, in these pieces, there's three different things in conversation with each other. There is the wooden structure itself, which is shaping space in a particular way, kind of shapes a three-dimensional kind of spatial void or a spatial entity. So there's that. Then there is the color shape, the shapes defined by the color itself. Then there is the shape of the wood as it's defined by the color. And then there is the space itself, right? And so these are really about the interaction and the kind of weaving together of those things, trying to fuse those together into a single entity in some way. Yeah, so this is the most recent thing I can show you. I'm sorry I haven't left more time for questions, but we have 4 minutes.
Yeah, we have some time. Does anyone have any questions they'd like to ask Mark about his work?
Yes.
Mark?
Yes. Hi.
I know you've done some practical things like making furniture. You alluded to that.
Yeah.
Have you ever, based on your experience with the materials that you've used, have you ever built a boat?
I have not built a boat. Well, I should say I've helped people build boats. I'm, I can imagine doing it at some point, but it's a matter of priorities, right?
Okay, well, coming from Minnesota, I thought maybe that would be a natural for you, but.
Yeah, well, I actually grew up in the Chicago suburbs, but you'll be interested to know that when I was going to school in Michigan, in Holland, Michigan, at Hope College, actually, for a while, and I had a friend who, along with whose family had just purchased the old wooden boat plants and all the drawings from Chris Craft Corporation, which used to make all its wooden boats in Holland, but had, since they moved everything to fiberglass, had started elsewhere. So this friend of mine and his family were putting Chris Crafts back into production under a different name, but using all the original drawings and everything. And I would spend a lot of time there. And so the answer is yes, I'd love to build a boat.
Well, thank you very much for your enlightening presentation.
I hope so.
We have another question in the comments, Mark. Do you make anything that could live outdoors?
Oh, that's an excellent question. I have. I've done a lot of the earlier work I did in steel could go outside. Technically, the big ceramic pieces could live outside, but they would be, of course, vulnerable to small children climbing and vandalism and things like that. But mostly, my work has been focused on sort of gallery things. I'm I think if there's something that we could, a way of sort of summarizing what I do, you know, it's 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 that I think the reason I make that I am still in love with sculpture and why I've spent so much of my life doing it is that in some ways it's sort of the hardest thing I knew how to do with my various interests. The most challenging way I could think to spend my life. You know, it involves, on the one hand, it's a kind of an intellectual problem, right? There is a thinking aspect to it. It's also a visual problem. It's also a material problem. And I love the way it sort of brings those things together. And for me, um, making these kinds of objects has been the best way to pursue that.
And a follow-up from the same question about the outdoors. They said, so many of your pieces look like made from other materials. They'd be happy outdoors in parks and gardens.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. I think that that could be true. I'm thinking about pursuing some public commissions. It is something I'd like to do. I would like to leave a couple of big, heavy, permanent things in places that would become other people's problem after I die. Yeah.
Sounds good. Go ahead and do it, Mark.
All right.
All right, I'll leave a minute for last minute questions to either be typed or spoken. And then I have a quick question for you, Mark, while we wait and see if we have any follow-up questions.
Sure.
Your clay works, I wondered if they're fired or if you leave them unfired.
No, they're fired. Thank you. Yeah, it's hard to fit everything in. They are fired. They're for anybody in ceramics. They're made out of a low fire redware that I to which I add fiberglass, chopped fiberglass, which helps with things this size to keep them from cracking while they dry. And then they're fired to cone 04 or about 2000 degrees. The surfaces are not glazed, they're painted. Although I have worked with glazes, and that's because the only way to move these is to be able to take them apart. And so if you look here, there's this joint there and here, and then there's a threaded rod that runs all the way through them and sort of clamps them together. But there's no, as a practical matter, there's no way to make them really in one piece and get them in a kiln, for instance. And so if they were glazed, every time I took them together or put them apart, they would probably chip, whereas the paint can be touched up.
Right. Yeah. These actually remind me of chimneys from some sort of children's fairy tale or something.
Well, you know, they are by far the goofiest things I've ever made. You know, they are imaginative forms in some ways. I've never, and I think my work has never really taken up questions of the imagination in quite that way, or I should say that my imagination is one that really is an imagination about form within a certain context. But I've never made goofy, slightly funny, eccentric things. And you know, one way of thinking of these is that each of them is sort of in a kind of an extreme character, right? You're at a party full of people who are unashamed of wearing ridiculous costumes.
Very nice. All right. Do we have any last minute questions? Okay, well, thank you so much for attending, everyone, Art Club today. A huge thanks to Mark Holmes for presenting his amazing work to us. And this will be recorded and put on our YouTube channel. So if you'd like to go back and watch any other parts, please feel free.
Well, that's terrifying. Okay.
Be sure to tune in next month, Tuesday, March 9th at 1 p.m. when we host Margaret Lejeune for a special presentation of their work. Thanks to our museum members and Visionary Society members for their continued support, making our virtual programming possible. Thank you, everyone, so much.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Mark.
Have a great day. Bye.